All right, so imagine this. Okay, Fort Knox, right? It's not just overflowing with gold, but it's like a server farm. Okay, it's got billions in Bitcoin, like right there, as part of the U.S. strategic reserves.
It does. It sounds like something out of science fiction, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a wild concept, but some serious researchers are actually exploring this. And, well, today we're going to unpack all the potential consequences.
It's really interesting because this idea, of a country adding Bitcoin to its reserves, like alongside gold and foreign currencies,
Hmm.
it really makes you question, like, what does a strategic reserve even mean in this digital world,
Yeah, for sure. So for anyone out there who maybe hasn't spent their nights, poring over the details of national reserves, can you just break it down? Like, why do countries even bother with these things?
Well, think of it like this, a country's financial safety net, okay? So it's this stockpile of assets that they can use in emergencies,
Right.
right? If there's a big economic crisis or to stabilize their own currency. Think back to 2008, the whole financial crisis, countries that had strong reserves, they were much better prepared to, like, weather that storm.
Okay, that makes sense. But Bitcoin, I mean, isn't that the thing that's famous for being super volatile? Like you see those headlines, Bitcoin price goes crazy all the time. Wouldn't that be a risky choice for a national reserve?
Yeah, you're hitting on one of the big questions that this research really tries to wrestle with.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is definitely known for its volatility, and the potential for big losses is real. I mean, it's a legitimate concern. But on the other hand, you have to think about its fixed supply,
Yeah.
right? There's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoins. So that makes it incredibly scarce, and that's why some people see it as a way to protect against inflation, which could actually eat away at the value of those traditional reserves.
So it's kind of like a high risk, high reward situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's really important to remember that this research paper is just one perspective on this whole issue, right? There are people who feel very strongly about Bitcoin on all sides. So what we want to do today is just walk you through those potential upsides and downsides, just lay it all out as the research presents it, and then you can, draw your own conclusions.
Okay, cool. No crystal ball predictions here, just a deep dive into the possibilities. So first things first, why would the U.S. even think about holding Bitcoin? I mean, wouldn't that kind of weaken the dollar?
That's another one of the big questions that this research tackles. One argument is that holding Bitcoin could actually strengthen the U.S.'s position in the long run, especially as the world becomes more and more digital.
How so?
Well, for one thing, it would diversify their reserves, beyond just the U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
The dollar is still the dominant currency globally, but it's not immune to economic forces,
Mm.
So adding Bitcoin could be a strategic move to protect against risks to the dollar.
So it's like not putting all your eggs in one basket, even if that basket is like the almighty dollar.
Exactly. Precisely. And then there's the potential for the U.S. to position itself as a leader in this whole digital economy.
Yeah.
Embracing Bitcoin could attract a lot of investment in blockchain technology, and that has implications way beyond just cryptocurrency.
Right.
Like think about supply chain management, secure voting systems, even like revolutionizing how we verify identities.
Yeah, because blockchain isn't just about Bitcoin. It's a whole new way of doing things, and it's moving fast.
Exactly. And then you've got the geopolitical angle to consider. Bitcoin is decentralized by its very nature.
Yeah.
It doesn't belong to any one country or central bank, so that makes it less vulnerable to, political manipulation or economic crises in specific parts of the world.
Okay, that's interesting. So even if there's turmoil in one part of the world, Bitcoin could stay relatively stable.
Yeah, that's the theory. It'd be like this global digital safe haven,
Mm-hmm.
independent of those traditional financial players. Now, of course, this is all hypothetical, and there are some really big challenges and risks, which we're going to dig into next. But the research does make some pretty compelling arguments for why the U.S. might at least consider this radical move.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this is such a hot button issue. It's not just about Bitcoin itself, it's about the whole future of money and power in a digital world. But I'm still kind of stuck on that volatility thing. How could the U.S. justify holding something that's so unpredictable?
That's the million-dollar question, or I guess maybe the million Bitcoin question, as it were. And that's where this research gets really fascinating. It really delves into how the U.S. might manage that volatility. All the potential regulatory hurdles and the global implications of a move like this.
Okay, I'm ready to unpack all that. Hit me with the potential downsides, because I'm sure there are a bunch.
Yeah. So let's start with that volatility issue. You're absolutely right. Bitcoin is known for those crazy price swings. And that's a huge concern for anyone thinking about using it as a reserve asset, let alone a country like the U.S., with a lot on the line. The research actually tackles this head on, and they look at a few ways to manage it.
Okay, so what are they proposing? Are they just going to cross their fingers and hope for the best?
Not quite. One scenario they outline involves like a phased approach. So the U.S. wouldn't just jump all in on Bitcoin right away.
Hmm.
They'd start by allocating a really small percentage of their reserves, like
Mm.
maybe 1% or even less, and then gradually increase that amount over time as they learn how to manage it and as the market itself kind of matures.
So like dipping a toe in the water before jumping in the deep end, does that really make a difference with volatility though?
It could.
Mm.
By starting small, they're limiting their exposure to those price swings, right? Plus, it gives them time to figure out how Bitcoin actually behaves within their portfolio and come up with strategies to reduce the risk.
That makes sense. A much more cautious approach for sure. But what about the global impact? We talked about Bitcoin not being tied to any specific country. What happens if other countries decide to follow the US's lead?
That's where things get really interesting. The research suggests that a U.S. move into Bitcoin could actually set off a global scramble with other countries rushing to get their hands on it too, almost like a new kind of arms race, but with digital currency. And this could drive up demand, which could benefit early adopters like the U.S.
So being the first mover could give them an advantage, but wouldn't that also raise some concerns about, fairness and potential manipulation? What's to stop powerful countries from hoarding Bitcoin and creating like a more unequal financial system?
Yeah, you've hit on a really crucial point. This research doesn't shy away from those concerns at all. It emphasizes how important international cooperation and transparency would be to prevent a situation where Bitcoin just makes existing global inequalities worse,
Yeah.
you know? And it suggests that if the U.S. does decide to hold Bitcoin, they'd have to be super careful about how they manage it, both in terms of security and communication with other countries.
So it's not just about the economic benefits for the US, they'd have a responsibility to consider the wider global impact too.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about responsibility, let's shift gears a little bit and think about the impact on everyday people. We can't just focus on governments and central banks. How would this affect the average person who might not even fully grasp how Bitcoin works?
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the macroeconomics of it all, but this could have real consequences for people's lives.
For sure. The research acknowledges that widespread Bitcoin adoption could lead to some instability and uncertainty, especially for people who don't have the resources or the knowledge to navigate this new landscape. Imagine a world where Bitcoin becomes more and more integrated into the global economy.
So businesses are pricing things in Bitcoin. People are using it for everyday purchases. Are we even still using dollars at that point?
That's a huge question. The research actually explores a range of scenarios, from Bitcoin becoming a widely accepted form of payment to governments even collecting taxes in Bitcoin. It would be a massive shift from the financial systems we're used to.
It's pretty mind-boggling to think about. But let's be real for a second. Bitcoin has also been associated with things like hacking and theft. Wouldn't adopting it on a national level create a massive security risk?
Security is definitely a major concern. The research really stresses the need for strong cybersecurity measures to protect those national Bitcoin reserves from theft or manipulation. We're talking about potentially billions of dollars worth of digital assets here.
Yeah, that sounds like a huge responsibility, not just for the US, but for any country thinking about holding Bitcoin.
Exactly. And it's not just about protecting against outside threats.
Yeah.
There's also the issue of internal controls, making sure there's no fraud or mismanagement within government agencies themselves.
Okay, so we've got volatility, global implications, potential impact on everyday people, security risks. What else? What other challenges do they highlight?
Well, there's also the environmental impact. Think about Bitcoin mining. The process of creating new Bitcoins is really energy intensive. It requires a ton of computing power, which means a lot of electricity consumption.
So embracing Bitcoin could have some unintended consequences for the environment.
Exactly. The research suggests that governments would need to carefully weigh the potential economic benefits of Bitcoin against its environmental costs. And they'd also need to explore ways to mitigate those costs, maybe by incentivizing the use of renewable energy for Bitcoin mining.
It's clear that this is a complicated issue with a lot of different factors at play. And it's not just about the US either. How do they think other countries will react to a US move into Bitcoin, particularly countries with those more centralized financial systems?
That's a really important question. The research suggests that countries like China, which are already developing their own central bank digital currencies, might see Bitcoin as a direct threat to their control over their own financial systems.
So it could spark a kind of digital currency rivalry, like a digital Cold War almost?
It's a possibility. The research imagined the scenario where countries with those centralized systems double down on their own digital currencies,
Yeah.
leading to a fragmented global financial landscape with all these competing currencies fighting for dominance.
Wow, that's a pretty intense picture. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? There are potential upsides to this as well.
Well, absolutely. The research also points to the potential for increased financial inclusion, especially in developing countries where access to traditional banking is limited. Bitcoin, with its decentralized nature and relatively low transaction fees, could offer a more accessible and affordable option for people who are currently shut out of the global financial system.
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the concerns of powerful nations, but we can't forget about the billions of people around the world who could benefit from a more inclusive system.
Exactly. And while there are definitely big challenges and risks with Bitcoin, it also gives us this opportunity to rethink and reshape how we think about money and finance in general.
So we've covered the potential downsides, the volatility, security risks, environmental concerns, low-level power dynamics, but we've also touched on some potential upsides, like increased financial inclusion and a chance for innovation. What I'm still grappling with is the more philosophical side of all this. What does it mean for how we understand money itself?
That's a question that goes way beyond just economics and finance. It gets into the very nature of value and trust.
Okay, I'm ready for that deep dive. Let's explore those bigger questions in part 3 of our exploration of Bitcoin as a potential U.S. strategic reserve.
Okay, so welcome back. We've spent the last two parts really digging into the practical side of the U.S. maybe holding Bitcoin, right? The economics, the geopolitics, the environmental stuff. But this research, it really pushes us to think bigger, almost philosophically. Like, what does Bitcoin, this digital decentralized thing, what does it do to our whole idea of what money even is?
Yeah, it really shakes things up, doesn't it? Like for centuries, we've relied on tangible things, gold or the authority of governments to back our currencies. But Bitcoin, it's playing by a completely different set of rules. It's borderless, it's built on complex cryptography, and its value isn't determined by any single entity.
So it's like a currency built for the internet age, not bound by the old rules.
Exactly. And that forces us to really confront some basic questions about trust, like who or what are we trusting when we use Bitcoin? It's not a government, it's not a bank. It's like math code. Yeah, it's pretty mind-bending. And this research suggests that could actually have a real impact on our relationship with institutions, especially governments.
Right. Like if people start seeing Bitcoin as a more stable store of value than traditional currencies, it could really erode trust in central banks and those government-controlled financial systems. Imagine a world where people are just opting out of the traditional system altogether and choosing Bitcoin instead.
So like a shift in power, individuals having more control over their own finances, but wouldn't that also cause a lot of chaos?
It's not without its risks, for sure. The research goes into those potential downsides. Increased volatility in the global economy challenges for regulators, even the possibility of governments taking extreme measures to try and hold on to control.
It almost sounds like a battle between the old world and this new digital order.
That's a really interesting way to put it. And the research doesn't ignore the ethical side of things either. If access to Bitcoin is limited or if its value is constantly fluctuating, it can make existing inequalities even worse.
Right, technology on its own doesn't solve social problems. It can just as easily reflect them or even make them worse.
Exactly. The research really highlights how important it is to be aware of those potential pitfalls as we navigate this new landscape. It's a good reminder that technology is never neutral. It's shaped by human choices, and it can be used for good or for bad.
So after all of this, what's the big takeaway? Should we all be running out to buy Bitcoin, or should we be stuffing our dollars under the mattress?
I think the main thing to remember is that we're in uncharted territory here. The future of money is changing right before our eyes. And Bitcoin, whether it ultimately succeeds or fails, is a powerful symbol of that change. It's forcing us to rethink our assumptions and have these conversations about what we want the future of finance to look like.
This whole deep dive has been quite a journey. We've explored this hypothetical scenario of the U.S. holding Bitcoin, looked at the economic and geopolitical implications, even pondered some pretty deep philosophical questions. But this research was focused on the U.S. What about the rest of the world?
That's the question that really sticks with you, right? If the U.S. were to actually take this step, what kind of ripple effect would it have on other countries? Would we see a global rush to acquire Bitcoin, a complete breakdown of the financial system as we know it, or something we haven't even imagined yet? That's something we all need to be thinking about because those answers are going to shape the world for a long time to come.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the potential consequences of the U.S. adding Bitcoin to its strategic reserves. It's a topic that's complex, controversial, and constantly changing. But one thing's for certain, it's a conversation that's only going to become more important as we move further into the digital age. Thanks for joining us on this exploration.